last at our place meeting 6th grade.
You take it back.
We hired old brothers.
I've heard of them.
All right, here we go. We're gonna
Just a 3-man group.
Really?
They're really going quick.
I'll take them along.
Don't know. I can send them a message and see if students find out.
We need another set of books under it.
No, we're fine.
Oh, we break this.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, who did, he's ready for.
We're gonna have to put an engineer after his name. John Howell, engineer.
Say again.
John Howell, engineer.
That's
I'm
right.
not gonna say what kind of.
Engineer,
Engineer.
engineer.
Church engineer.
In World War II, we called it jerry.
Well, it's been called a lot of things.
Yeah, I didn't go there. I didn't.
Well, February 14th, I hope to get my new hearing aids.
Yeah.
Oh, you haven't.
Is that what
Are
you
you
get for
saying-
Valentine's Day?
It will be good for any day, but yes.
How did you convince them to give you new ones?
I go to Panama City. I didn't have to do anything.
Well, but yours had, I mean, they were.
Mine are,
had almost
multiple
failed.
years old and, my hearing is terrible and
Well, mine are 13, right?
how old?
From 2014 until now.
Then, where do you go to VA at?
Pensacola.
That's
That's
why-
why they send us for the hearing aids.
They
The
have-
closest one is Panama City. I stopped going to Pensacola.
They didn't have one in Panama City for a long time.
Yeah.
And now they do.
You're live.
So it's worth checking out.
You're alive.
Oh, you're live.
Perfect.
Sorry. We
No,
won't
no.
talk anymore medical.
Not hearing
But-
aids anyway.
Yeah.
Panama City.
You know what they did? They renewed-
All right. Good morning, everybody. This morning, we will be in the book of Daniel, and we will be in Daniel 1, verses 8 to 21. And so in this, we're going to go over a little bit about the story in just a minute. But before we start, I want to capture two questions that will kind of frame the story about Daniel and his friends. And it also, at the same time, is a question that's very relevant today for us. And so here are the two questions. What commitments, actually there's three, what commitments are the most difficult to keep? And so if you make a commitment to God, if you make a commitment to a friend, if you make a commitment to your spouse, if you make any of these commitments, what commitments are the most difficult? And the second question, what makes keeping a commitment so challenging? We make commitments and then we find them very difficult. In our Christian life, we have it, we say we're committed to being a Christian. So in being committed, what commitments have we made? And why are they so challenging to keep if we make this commitment? And thirdly, how does keeping our commitment define our integrity? And so I know in a personal level, if you've made a commitment to a family member or to work, then when you keep that commitment, keeping that commitment tells everyone around you something about you. And it's easy if somebody makes a commitment to you to do something and they do it, and every time they say that they'll do something, they do it, then that tells you about their integrity. And so you rapidly reach a point with those people that if they tell you something, they mean it. They will follow through. So as we look at our commitment that we've made to God, does it say the same thing? Does it show that we will follow through? When we take a commitment, we make that commitment seriously. So here in Daniel 1, verses 8 to 11. So in the story of 1 to 21, I'm going to give some background to it, and then we'll go into the verses. So, and I may mess up, I'm sure I'll mess up some of these names. Jehoiakim was one of Judah's last kings, and we were saying last kings when we were talking about Ezekiel. In 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, laid siege to Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar defeated Jehoiakim and took to Babylon many vassals from the temple to deposit them in his house for his God. The king ordered his chief official, Ashpenaz, to bring to Babylon as many resource as a resource many youths from Judean royal family and nobility. And so he gathered for the king these young people and showed the most prominent in both aptitude and appearance. And so then Nebuchadnezzar ordered these young people to learn the literature and language of the Babylonians so he might utilize them in service to him. So after he took over Israel, then now we see these young people that weren't just any young people. They were from royal families and nobilities. He took these people and brought them back with him among other people. And now these people that were in line to the throne or in line just because of nobility are now going to serve him in his palace. And as part of that, there is a 3-year program to make you ready for service. And so we'll see that also. And it wasn't just being ready for service. The king treated the new captives well, and he appointed a daily ration of his best food and wine to these young people, because he wants the young people to understand the language, the literature, and he wants them to be capable of functioning within his royal court. So at the end of the 3 years of training, they would come before the king and they would hopefully enter his service. And included among the captives, we know of 4 people. We know Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so we probably remember the names more on the lines of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so we know their Jewish names, and we know what they were renamed when they were taken captive. So Daniel determined he did not want to defile himself with the king's wine or food. So consequently, we're going to see he's going to ask that he not eat that food. And so the concern with the food is Jewish dietary law. And so if you're eating meat is to be prepared a certain way to be within the Jewish dietary law. And so if you're eating meat and you don't know if it has been prepared correctly, then you are breaking the law out of Leviticus that talks about how do we eat meat. And also importantly, it's not only how do we cook it, are we eating the right meat? Are we breaking a dietary law? And one of the things, or several of the animals that everyone else ate that the Jews didn't, pork for one, horse, there were all sorts of animals that Jews against biblical law did not eat. And so if you were eating all of the meat prepared by the king, there was a good chance you were breaking dietary law. And so that's why we see, to avoid that, we're going to see in this story, he just wants to eat not the meat. He wants to eat the vegetables and water. And so with that, we're going to see the results of it. And so in verses, now we have a little bit of the story behind what's going to happen. So in verse 8, Daniel determined that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine he drank. So he asked permission from the chief eunuch not to defile himself. So this is the first person he's asking. God granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the chief eunuch. Yet, now the chief eunuch here, God has intervened on behalf of Daniel, and we see that God has granted Daniel kindness and compassion from this chief eunuch. And so imagine now, when we look at this story, I also, before we go forward, I want you to think about the turmoil in his life. They were living as royalty or as very important people, very important young people in Israel. They lost the war. They were taken away to a foreign country. They're being forced to learn a foreign language. They're being forced to understand the literature of the foreign people. They're being forced to have new dietary rules. They're being forced to live in a new environment. They're being, I mean, there's just all of these, they're being forced. And so Daniel and his friends are young. And so they're now going to enter 3 years of training. And it doesn't say what happens if you don't pass the training, but obviously if you're going through training, there is a concern of, well, what if I don't do very good? What if this language is too hard to learn? What if the literature is too hard to understand? It just doesn't make sense. So I bring that up because in this, what we don't see is Daniel's concern to getting out of the country. We don't see Daniel's concern for going back to Israel. We don't see Daniel's concern for not having to learn the language or why. And the question that we like to ask today is, why is this happening? You know, I'm leading, I'm following God, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. And yet all of this befalls us today, all these different events that are going on that we have no control over. And so looking at Daniel, do we have the same look and worldview of life, not worldly view, a view of life that's based on serving God? Because if our view is based on serving God, then whatever task we will be given in life, whatever task we have, whatever problems arise, then the focus remains on God. How is my life with God? Not how come God left me where I'm at? So that's what we see here. Daniel is concerned not about being in the palace away from home and all that. His concern is, we're going to have to eat this food. And how can I be a good Jewish person and obey the law if I have to eat this food? I'm going to not be able to do what God's commanded. So that's where he has asked not to defile himself with that food. And even we see God granted Daniel kindness and compassion from the eunuch. Yet, now this is the response for the first person he asked. Yet he said to Daniel, I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and drink. So the problem here is the eunuch isn't the one saying, this is the food we're going to eat. This is from the king, and the king is providing the best. And the worry that the chief eunuch has is, and that's what he's explaining. The king has said this. I fear my lord the king, who assigned your food and drink. What if he sees your faces looking thinner than the other young men your age? You would endanger my life with the king. And so he's asked a person outside of the Jewish faith, I don't want to do this because it will defile my faith. And the person he asked, although the person he asked has been granted kindness and compassion for Daniel, his fear of the king is still such that he can't make that decision. He can't say, I'm going to override what the king says, because if he does, and Daniel and his friends physically show that they are not as healthy as everyone else, that's where he says, you'll endanger my life, which is, I'm afraid the king will kill me because I went against what the king said. So in 8 to 10, we see several things. Daniel determined that he would not defile himself. So that word determined means he set it in his heart. Daniel does not want to eat the meat because he doesn't know how it's prepared, and he doesn't know if it's the right animal. And so now that he's determined in his heart, he has also asked the first person, the chief eunuch, can I not eat this? He's wanting to observe it. So the word defile, when he says he doesn't want to defile himself, that word, Daniel's concern is to maintain dietary laws in Leviticus chapter 11. And that's where Leviticus said, this is how you eat. This is what God said. And God wants a holy life, and that holy life had touched every aspect of how do you live, including dietary laws. So Daniel wanted to maintain his Jewish identity and his culture in as far as he could, even though he now lived in Babylon. So following God wasn't something that you just did in Israel. Following God was because you have a relationship with God, and that is your identity. So as Christians today, we don't follow God because we're at church. We follow God because that's our identity. We say we are Christians. Well, that is our identity. For Daniel, he was a Jew. That was his identity. And so, like we said, pork and horse meat were among the unclean foods the Babylonians ate, and other acceptable meat might not have had the blood drained properly. And that's Leviticus 17, 13 to 14. So even if they were giving you meat that was okay, they may not have prepared it okay. And so eating the king's food would result in Daniel compromising his religious convictions. And further, Babylonian religious officials often offered a portion of the king's food to the Babylonian gods prior to sending the rest to the palace. And so now not only does he not know what the meat is, he doesn't know if it was prepared, but he doesn't want to take part in a meal that a portion of the meal has already been dedicated to these Babylonian gods. So there were all sorts of issues. So Daniel did not want to associate himself with the food and drink offered to other gods. And that question arose in the early church as well in 1 Corinthians 10, 25 to 28. And so the idea of living and your identity being a Christian, you live as a Christian, your identity is a Christian. And so just as the first century church brought up these issues of eating, which, nowadays we really don't even, do we really think about eating? But the first century church did, and definitely the Israelites did. And so, like we said, he asked the chief eunuch, although he was sympathetic and kind, he was afraid for his life. And so that is what he was afraid of. If you disobeyed the king, Nebuchadnezzar, then you would probably pay for your life. So now the first person Daniel asked has said, I understand what you're asking. If we do this, I'm risking my life. So now then, 11 to 13. So does Daniel give up? No, because Daniel wants to obey what God says. And so Daniel, when he was told no, he's now looking for the second opportunity. So 11 to 13. So Daniel said to the guard, whom the chief eunuch had assigned to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So now we went from the chief eunuch, now we have this guard that's watching over us. So he said to the guard, please test your servants for 10 days. Let us be given vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food, and deal with your servants based on what you see. Now, Daniel has a leap of faith. He knows he is trying to do what God wants. He is trying to observe the law. He is trying to eat, knowing that he doesn't know how the meat is prepared. So he's assuming it's not prepared. It's not kosher. It's not prepared correctly. So to avoid that, then he's not wanting to eat it. And so his leap of faith is, now imagine how many people have had a diet that was 10 days and at the end of 10 days you saw great change? Nothing, right? I have never, the only diet I've ever had that at 10 days I saw a difference was called food poisoning. And in the process of the diet called food poisoning, at the end of 10 days, I had substantial weight loss. I didn't look healthy, but I did have substantial weight loss. And so really, if you do any diet, you're not thinking in 10 days, it's made a substantial impact where I could look at this person and that person and go, wow, that was a really effective diet. So when Daniel's saying 10 days, that is, unless God intervenes, there's not going to be any difference. And then he tells the guard this, then examine our appearance and the appearance of the young men who are eating the king's food. So he telling you yourself, you'll be able to make the difference. You'll see it. It will be evident. If you look at those people who eat the king's food and you look at us, there'll be a visible difference. And he tells him, when you see it, he says, and deal with your servants based on what you see. And so he has so much faith that God will make a difference, and the difference will be so evident that now the guard who is watching them will be willing to go against what the king says, because he can see it's not that it doesn't have any effect, it has a great effect. So this is the second time Daniel has asked somebody. And the second time he's saying, here's the test, 10 days, that's all we're asking. Now remember, this is a 3-year program before we see the king. And so 10 days is not much of a risk. So with that, when we talk about in the verses, when it talks about giving vegetables to eat and drink, the word translated vegetables in verse 12 likely refers to anything that grows from seeds, including fruit, vegetables, and grain. So it would have been a large variety at their choice of being fed. And so it's like it says, it's more likely anything that grew from seeds, which is fruit, vegetables, and grains. And so with that, if the guard agreed to feed him the menu, Daniel and his friends could maintain their integrity with Jewish law. And so the only way, now the eunuch said, if we go against the king and you look bad, I'm afraid. And the guard, he's trying to avoid that, the fear. And so there'll be such a marked change, the guard won't have to worry about it, because they'll just appear better than everybody else. There's no risk. And 10 days out of a 3-year program, it's not going to be any risk either. And so Daniel took a leap of faith, because he knew in his heart, he had already determined that he was going to obey the law. And in order to obey it, the only way to do it was for God to intervene and allow it through eating the vegetables and still looking better than his peers. So in 14 to 16, we see this. He agreed with them about this test and tested them for 10 days. So he agreed, and like I said, there's not a lot of risk in 10 days out of 3 years. And so, and the guard would have understood that the reason he was doing this, like he told the head eunuch, Daniel and his friends wanted to honor God, and they wanted to live within the laws that God had given. So even if the test failed, Daniel and his friends provided the first witness of faith, but it didn't fail. But the first witness to these foreigners, these Babylonians, was Daniel wanting to do without the best that the king could provide. That is a huge, when we go out to eat now, if you wanted to just go, I want the best that my city has to offer, it might be a big expensive steak cooked by a great chef with all sorts of sides, and it would be rather expensive. It's not something that you could do. It's maybe something you would do only every once in a while, maybe even once a year. It's not, this is how we're going to eat every day. And yet Daniel is being provided from the king's table, from his food every single day. And so he's asking, just let me eat less. I will be satisfied with only eating the vegetables in order to maintain the dietary law and live for God. So with that, there's a note in here. God provides small and large opportunities to live our integrity before others. And even today, they were given a choice. They faced that choice knowing what God wanted and knowing what the dietary laws were. And then they made a choice that we're going to ask to not break the dietary laws. So when others see us trust God's word, God can use us to draw them to Christ. And so being a witness, like we said, when we first started with those questions about commitments and what commitments are difficult to keep and how does keeping a commitment define our integrity? Well, one of the things we know about commitments is when people say they're a Christian and they're outside of the church, they're at work with their friends, wherever they are, does their commitment mean as much there as it does within the church walls? Do your people you go around with, the people you meet at work, the people that you know, do they just know we won't even ask them to do this because they have a commitment in their life not to do whatever it is that they're going to ask, so we're not even going to bring it up? Do you have that level of commitment? And that's what we see here with Daniel. Daniel's level of commitment was such that I don't even want to break the food laws. I want to live a complete life to God, but in doing that, he can live it in Babylon. He can do that. There's no requirement to be in Israel to be a Christian, or to be a Jew. In fact, they were taken off into captivity. So they can still live that way. They can still worship God, but in the wholeness of his living for God, he doesn't even want to break the dietary laws. So in verse 17, God gave these 4 young men knowledge and understanding in every kind of literature and wisdom. Did I jump ahead? No. Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. So remember, in part of this training program, they're studying the language and the literature, because obviously when they go before the king, there's going to be some type of test. That besides the appearance test, like you guys filled out really good, you don't look like you're half starved anymore. You don't look, that type of look. You look healthy. I want you to be in the court. There's also, do you understand the language? And do you understand the literature? Do you understand Babylonia? And so here we see that not only are they going to be blessed, but God has given these 4 young men knowledge and understanding. Now let's talk about this. God works in the lives of Daniel and his friends during their training period. The term knowledge describes the depth of learning the young men were able to master. As newcomers to Babylon, they had a lot to learn about Babylonian life and culture, and God gave them the ability to do so. The word translated understanding denotes intelligence and skill. They were able to take what they learned and apply it skillfully in each situation. So you can have a lot of knowledge, but if you don't have understanding, then you're going to lack an application. And so not only were they able to understand it, they were able to apply it. Further, God blessed their work related to every kind of literature and wisdom. And so there is moving to a different culture is it's difficult just to understand the norms. How does the day work? How does the shopping, like, okay, as an easy example, when my wife and I and family lived in Italy, when you went to the market, to a grocery store, then all the carts are outside, none of the carts are inside. And everyone knows you have to have a 50 € coin in order to get a cart, because you're going to take that coin and push it into the cart and it releases a lock. And now it holds the coin. You can't get it out until you bring it back, but it releases it. Now you can go shopping. And when you're done shopping, you drop that cart off because you want your 50 cents back. And so, but if you don't know that and you show up inside the store, there are no carts. And no one's just going to give you their cart because it's got 50 cents locked into it. And an easy thing was there were no people that ran around with moving carts in and out. And the second one was, if someone just walked away from a cart, somebody was going to grab it because they just got a free cart and they get to keep the 50 cents. So the other thing, when we went, they had, and I don't remember the exact hours, but there was like 2 hours of the day right after lunch, and it closed. Everything closed. We were going to go home. We're going to have meals with our family. And when they closed, I'm saying they like literally locked the gate. And so if you wanted to park in the grocery store parking lot and do other shopping, you could come back and see you're not leaving until the siesta time is over. So, and that's nowadays. And those were a lot of confusing things when we first got over there. So imagine you're going to a foreign country against your will, and now you're going to live there. So it was very important for them to understand the literature because that helped them understand the way the people thought. And now we also see at the end, there's a comment that Daniel also understood visions and dreams of every kind. And that was a foreshadow of the ministry he would have for the rest of the book, the rest of his life. So chapter 2 shows Daniel received a vision to interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream in verses 19 to 24. And then later, Daniel interpreted another Nebuchadnezzar dream in chapter 4, 19 to 27. And then in chapter 5, and starting in verse 24, he interprets the handwriting on the wall. And chapters 7 to 12 record 4 lengthier visions that Daniel experienced during his ministry. So we're seeing early on in Daniel's life the result of obeying God. And that was God's blessing him so that he could live and be used in Babylon, not blessed so that he would immediately get to return home and everything would be okay again in Israel. So in verses 18 to 21, now this is how quickly time passes in the Bible. And sometimes we forget how quickly this goes. At the end of the time, 3 years have passed. At the end of the time that the king had said to present them, the chief eunuch presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king interviewed them. Now, right off, if the chief eunuch's afraid to not give you the diet that the king said because it would cost him his life, I would be pretty concerned about this interview that I'm getting ready to go in. So the king interviewed them, and among all of them, the whole group that's being interviewed, no one was found equal to Daniel, Mananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So God blessed all 4 of them. And in the story, we see Daniel is the one doing the speaking, and yet really he's speaking for the group. There were 3 other people that were with Daniel that were willing to say, we are going to obey the dietary laws. We're going to follow God in everything that God says. Now, we don't know, are they the only 4 Jews or not? We don't know that, but we know these 4 Jews were determined to obey what God had said. And so here we see when the king interviewed them, no one is like them. So as a result, they began to attend the king in every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about. He found them 10 times better than all the magicians and mediums in his entire kingdom. Daniel remained, now we're having a glimpse of how the time ends. Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus. So when we look at this, we see some great things. And so that the chief eunuch presented them. And so Daniel and his friends certainly had questions in their mind, like, what if we fail? What is the result? You know, that would be my question. What if we don't do so good? And so, but God had empowered them through their training for this specific day. And so details of the interview are not here, but we know the result. No one was equal to them. So we don't know what the test was, you know, how is the test performed or what are the content, but we know no matter what it was, because of God in their lives, no one was better. And it doesn't reveal the number of candidates, but we know however many there were, these 4 stood out above everyone. Now remember, these are young people. And so these young people, what we're going to see is, they had in every matter of wisdom and understanding that the king consulted them about, he found them 10 times better than his magicians and mediums in the entire kingdom. So these weren't just normally like we got smart because we studied. This is direct result of God intervening. And God is showing a difference. The people that he brought that worship God, that are now standing before the king, they are better than anybody that he talks to in his own kingdom. So that every matter of wisdom and understanding expands the expression of knowledge and understanding. Wisdom denotes the proper application of knowledge to specific situations. As someone once said, knowledge is what you know, but wisdom shows you know how to use it. And so, you know, we've all seen people who knew a lot, but they didn't have self-control. And you're like, well, it doesn't matter how much you know, no one wants to be around that person because of the way they act or the way they portray themselves or the way that they respond to people. So wisdom shows that there's the ability to use correctly what you know. The word translated understanding describes the ability to analyze a situation and discern the proper path to take. So in the interview, the king had learned how much these young men knew. And in the days to follow, he quickly learned they could apply it to serving the king well. The king consulted them regularly and found out they were 10 times better. And so now imagine in this king's court, if you are the magicians, if you're the other word that they use, mediums. So mediums and magicians are also being replaced, not completely replaced, but if the king is asking the Jews what he should do in all aspects, then that really shows that the Jews are different. They have a knowledge and understanding like nobody else in the kingdom. And so they're staying in the royal court. And so the word translated mediums refers to a particular spiritual role in the Babylonian court and Babylonian worship. These individuals expected to discern the will of the Babylonian gods. And so now all of a sudden we have the Jews who worship the true God, and their knowledge is still better than these mediums who are supposed to be able to tell them what the Babylonian gods are wanting. And the word translated magician denotes another kind of official who commonly appeared in the royal court. And we see that in Exodus chapter 7, verse 11, when it talks about the court of Egypt had magicians during the days of Moses. Well, they had those magicians there, and they also, in the time of Nebuchadnezzar, he still had magicians. These individuals exercised a certain degree of power in a spiritual realm, and which in many cases was likely demonic. Kings employed them to discern also the wills of the gods. So the fact that these 4 young men were Jewish undoubtedly caused a concern among the local Babylonian officials, because we just, as Babylonians, we just took over the Israelites. We just brought a whole bunch of them back. And now these 4 people are smarter and wiser than everyone in the court. And the king is listening to them. So if they're, and then it's mentioned that they're 10 times smarter, which means they're just, it's visibly, you can visibly see the difference in how much smarter and how much wisdom they have at that young age compared to everyone else. So that would have been a worrisome thing for everyone else, that now the king is listening to the very people he took over more than he's listening to his own royal court. And so the statement that Daniel remained there until the first year of King Cyrus is used to reveal the length of his ministry. So he began training in the year 605 BC, and the first year of King Cyrus is 539 BC. And so during that time, he served and lived for God, and God blessed him, even though they are in a foreign country. They are the property of a foreign king. They can't just leave. So God used them where they were at. Now, this is back to that question. What commitments are the most difficult to keep? So an easy answer is the ones that have risk. First, if you're risking your life, that commitment is difficult. So we could risk my life. I could risk my work. I could risk my finances. I can risk. So that difficult to keep, it becomes a question if you start having a risk that has an impact in your life. If I do this, because this is how Christians live, and it has this negative impact, what if I lost my job? Well, that would be a commitment that's difficult to keep, and we find it challenging because of the consequence. A commitment that has no consequence is easy to keep. And so if I said to one of you, I am making a commitment, I'm going to go by Walmart and pick up a package of hot dogs and bring it to your house, it's not a very hard commitment. It was really no expense. It just took a little bit of time. The reality is it may not take any of my time, because I would just ask my wife, can you go pick this up? Right? So, how much was it of a commitment was it? It may not be that much, because I might have made the commitment and it really happened and you got your hot dogs that night. But the reality is I might not have had any work in it at all. And so those are the easiest commitments. The hard ones are what is going to cost. And it may be that we perceive it could cost, and which is a fear, or we know it's going to cost. But either way, the next question, how does keeping our commitments define our integrity? Because the question is, when we talk about becoming a Christian, we're saying God first, everything second. Nothing in my life is now going to ever rise to first. And so the difficulty in keeping the commitment is the cost and the fear that this is really, whatever it is, my job, my house, my car, my finances, my time, my whatever it is, if we start worrying that costs too much, then that's when we'll find that commitment to being a Christian difficult. We're now weighing the cost against our commitment. And so how does keeping our commitments define our integrity? The integrity is how we face the crisis in life, and knowing there may be a consequence, we still choose God. And we might know one of the consequences, we see it in the Bible without going there yet, is what if the consequence was going to be thrown in a giant pit of fire alive? Would your commitment, which defines your integrity, would it be God is still number one? And so no matter the consequence, no matter the cost, nothing ever rises to number one but God. That spot's taken. So when there's a choice in my life, I always choose God, and I let God go with me through the consequence. And that is the beginning story that we see here of Daniel. From the very beginning, he said, I'm going to choose this, and I will let God worry about the consequence. And that's the life he led. So it's a great start to the book, and I thank everyone for coming. And David, if I could have you close this, please.
Dear Lord, we thank you for allowing us to be in your house this morning to study your word and to see where you protected your children as they were obedient to you. We can draw strength from that, knowing that you will provide for us and protect us if we will draw close to you and to honor you. Now, everything doesn't always work out perfect just because we stand for you. Sometimes that stand is a witness for someone else to make a decision. And we just pray that you will continue to lead us, and we are witnesses in this community. Pray that you will be with us as we go out and shine our light each day. Pray that you will go with us now as we go into the service hour. Be with Brother John as he brings the message. Be with Miss Teresa as she leads us in worship, dear Lord. All these things we ask in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.
I was looking for a tripod, going, where? Yeah. So he-